amongst its objectives, it also refers to the protection of children, of minors during penal cases. Another important point is the protection of the Roma minors and the telephone lines for young children who have disappeared, a rapid alert system, and at the same time to start up a kind of information counter within the site of the European Parliament, which is again for children, for minors. Again, these are just a few of the different points which are part of this package. This is an important package, and we need to understand the considerable efforts that have been made by the commissioners on the protection of children's rights in the European Union. Now, this brings me now to the draft directive. I'm the rapporteur on this draft directive. I'm the proposal to combat the sexual abuse and sexual exploitation of children and child pornography. I'd like to thank Mr. Sippel, Wikström, Lambert, Kirkhope and others who have helped me, and this has not always been easy. I'd also like to thank the Commissioner Malmström, who has very much wanted this directive to be prepared, and the Council, both the Polish presidency, the previous presidency, because they've been very, very dedicated to this, and also non-governmental organizations, UNICEF, Save the Children, a lot of other non-governmental organizations that have helped us and supported us in preparing this directive. This is the second measure after the approval of the Lisbon Treaty, particularly after the directive on human trafficking, and this is directed specifically to a legal area, that is to combat the sexual abuse, sexual exploitation of children and child pornography. This directive would take on board all of the indications of a resolution that was approved in 2009 by the Parliament, and as a point of reference it takes the Lanzarote Convention. Can I just mention a couple of points? The definition of the crimes, sexual abuse, pornography, the use and abuse of children for sexual exploitation. We refer to child pornography, and again here we refer to the Lanzarote Declaration, and we want uniform legislation across the European Union, and we want to take account of a situation in which a child is particularly vulnerable, or the crime was committed by a member of the family or by a person who has abused of his position or her position in, and then all of those who committed a crime will be banned. President, I thought I had a few more minutes because I also have to present. Okay, well, I think I do. I think I do.
Comunque vado alle conclusioni.
Mrs. Angelilli, 5 minutes now and 2 minutes later.
Okay.
You can take those 2 minutes now if you wish.
Vado alle conclusioni.
Okay, well, I'll go to the conclusions then. So, as I was saying, that as somebody who's already been to the court and has been convicted, this person can no longer work, not even in any kind of activity, not even as a volunteer with children. We've also seen that goods and funds that come from this crime can be taken away, and assistance for the victim to avoid double victimization. Now, sexual tourism and the crime of grooming online contact with minors and online pornography and pedopornography. All of these issues, illicit issues, are going to be taken into account. We're not talking about censorship, we're not talking about freedom of expression. Of course, we will look into this, but we will take into account the objective illustration, image of violence and pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And you will still have some time at the end to conclude. Can I apologize to colleagues for these slightly confusing and misleading signals on our display boards? I'm advised there's a slight technical problem, but I assure you that the time indicated is correct, so you have to go by that. Now, I turn to Mrs. Wikström, and you have 3 minutes.
När en vuxen förgriper sig sexuellt på ett barn.
If an adult makes a sexual advance towards a child, that is a serious crime. It can lead to trauma for the child and will certainly affect the future of that child in adult life. The whole problem doesn't stop there. We have the problem of images, video clips can then be put onto the internet as a result of that crime, which then show the crime endlessly into the future. With this directive and with its approval of this document, the European Union is trying to adopt the right way to deal with this kind of problem. After long and difficult negotiations with the Council and the Commission, the European Parliament can now be very pleased that it has a positive draft legislative document which calls upon the Member States of the European Union once and for all to make sure that sex tourism comes to an end and to make sure that this is dealt with at European level. So thank you very much to Roberta ANGELILLI, the rapporteur, and to the shadow rapporteurs for the very good collaboration. This has all led to a very satisfactory result that we can all be very proud of. If a Swedish person is responsible for sex tourism involving children, then he can now be prosecuted. In the past that was not possible, and now that person can be tried in their home country. This is important for developing countries as well, countries such as Thailand, where previously there were no punishable offences that could be brought against that person. It's important to recognise that we can now do something in the Member States against this kind of awful crime. That means a lot if we're to limit this kind of crime as much as we can. As a result of reducing this kind of crime, then fewer children will be affected negatively. With the internet, there are Member States that are taking measures to seize and prohibit the kind of images and material that is being portrayed on the internet. A third country outside of the European Union should also be able to have the opportunity to block this kind of content in a timely fashion. Member States have a duty to work closer with Member States in order to block this kind of material in a timely fashion before it can be used, if we can't stop it at the source. Ms. Angelilli's report shows that the European Parliament is committed to doing something about this problem, but we cannot let the work come to an end here. There still is a great deal of work that needs to be done. Thank you very much to all involved.
Thank you very much. Next, I shall be giving the floor to Mr. Kwiatkowski for the Council, and after that to Commissioner Malmström. And then I give notice, because our display board is not being helpful, I give notice that I shall be calling Mrs. KAMMEREVERT and then Mrs. YANNAKOUDAKIS, and I will give more warning as we go through this afternoon until the boards cooperate. In the meantime, Minister, you have the floor.
Szanowny Panie Przewodniczący. Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, honourable deputies to the European Parliament. At the very beginning, please let me thank you for all your efforts put into the directive on the sexual abuse of children. I would like to in particularly thank the Hungarian presidency, who, thanks to negotiations with the European Parliament, came up with a very good compromise. I'd like to warmly thank the European Commission, in particular Madam Commissioner Cecilia Malmström. Thank you very much, Madam. And a word of thanks towards Roberta ANGELILLI, the rapporteur of the entire project. We know how important the well-being of children to her is. That's also proved by the fact that she is a mediator for the European Parliament in aspects concerning children. It is most valuable that we could enjoy your support in those difficult negotiations. I am very happy that the EU is not behind, that reacts to the threats of the developments in the contemporary world. Those threats that are so dangerous for victims such as children. We want to come up with complex solutions. In this directive, we agreed upon solutions of particular treatment in criminal proceedings of minors abused by sexual exploitation. On the other hand, we focus on limiting repeated crime by introducing mechanisms of working with people who could potentially commit sexual crimes. We would not wish for the fact of border crossing to allow for less stringent treatment of criminals. This is why what should be paid attention to is the fact that we mention the impossibility of working with children if a given person crosses the border. Another issue worth mentioning is the correlation tables. We would not wish technical aspects to slow down our work on issues that until now have been treated with consensus. I hope that the reached compromise will allow us to adopt promptly the directive. Let me once again warmly thank all the MEPs who have contributed to the elaboration of this solution. I'd like to thank the previous Hungarian presidency and Madam Commissioner here present. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister, very much. After Commissioner Malmström, I shall be calling Mrs. KAMMEREVERT. So, Commissioner Malmström, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, Minister, honourable ladies and gentlemen. I will start first with the oral question. As you know, with the Lisbon Treaty, the protection of the rights of the child was introduced as an objective of the European Union, and this is made legally binding by the Charter of Fundamental Rights that guarantees the protection of the rights of the child. Now we must of course step up the efforts and put some action behind these beautiful words within the limits of EU competences, concrete actions with concrete results. And that's the aim of the EU Agenda for the Rights of the Child that the Commission adopted in February this year. The agenda pointed out something that you raised in your questions, the significant lack of reliable, comparable and official data of the situation of the children in the Member States. This is a serious problem for the development and implementation of a genuine evidence-based policy. The Fundamental Rights Agency has carried out important work in finding indicators to help developing policies in the rights of the child area. And thanks to the financial support of the Parliament, the Commission will also be able to carry out a pilot project on developing child rights data collection for developing evidence-based policies. And I am really grateful that the members of this House share the interest of data, for instance in children's effective access to justice. This is with the pilot project I mentioned, and we will be able to have by 2013 reliable and comparable data on children's effective access to justice from all the Member States. It is clear, of course, if we want our policies to be effective, that we need money. There is no specific budget line called Policies for Children, but there are various programmes within our budget that provide funding aimed at children. We have, for instance, the Daphne programme with a budget of €117 million, providing financial support to NGOs and local authorities to combat violence against children. We have the Fundamental Rights and Citizen programme, providing funding on child rights issues to national authorities and NGOs. And we have the Safer Internet programme with a total budget of €55 million, aims to empower and protect children online by awareness-raising initiatives. Under the new multiannual framework from 2014, we will continue to fund policies to deliver child-friendly justice, to protect children and safeguard their rights. With a similar amount of funding as in the current generation programmes, we will ensure a more efficient delivery for these actions, and this will be achieved through streamlined programmes and a better response to the needs. The EU agenda emphasised the importance of access to education and care services for small children. In the communication on early childhood education and care adopted earlier this year, the Commission set out key policy issues to be addressed at the European level to improve the accessibility and quality of service from birth to compulsory school age. In the conclusions of the Member States from May, they were invited to analyse the current situation, to reinforce measures to improve access to high quality services and invest in childhood education and care. And the Commission will set up a thematic working group of policymakers, academics, practitioners in early childhood education and care. In the area of judicial cooperation in civil matters, the Commission carefully monitors the correct application of the Brussels IIa regulation, which provides for common rules on jurisdiction, the recognition and enforcement of judgment in matters of parental responsibility and cross-border parental child abduction. The correct implementation of the Hague Convention on Child Abduction is here critical. The aim of the Convention is, as you know, to restore the status quo by means of a prompt return of wrongfully removed or retained children through cooperation between central authorities. In external relations, the Commission actively promotes the signature of this Convention to other countries. Child abduction and the common problem of missing children is a growing and a common problem. And it will not go away, unfortunately. We need to find tools to deal with this and tools for Member States to be able to cooperate with each other in cases where a child is abducted. We have child alert systems designed especially for cases of extremely worrying disappearances of children, such as child abduction. To date, a child alert system works in 10 Member States, and the Commission is committed to work with the other Member States so they are also rolled out in the 17 remaining. We have been encouraging Member States to set up their own national child alert system, and we support them operationally through exchange of best practices and financially to make sure that they are cross-border operational. The Commission launched a few years ago, with the financial support of the Parliament, a pilot project aiming to introduce child alert mechanism across Europe. This project consisted either of establishing a child alert system in those Member States and improving cooperation mechanism amongst neighbouring countries. This is crucial, and there are some good practices. For instance, we have the lutte anti-disparition d'enfants between France, Belgium and Britain that respects national sovereignty but gives procedures and possibility to share information. Some member states have not yet realised the values of these systems, and my colleague Vice President Reding has called on member states who have not yet introduced child alert mechanism to take all necessary steps for their implementation without delay. Child alert is not the only tool. We also have the 116000 hotline in Europe, designed to report missing children and offer support to families of the missing child. 16 member states have signed up to this, and we are of course making every effort for the rest of them to join this as well. We will continue to support and encourage member states within the powers of the Commission to ensure protection and promotion of the rights of the child. Passing now to the Angelilli report. Sexual crimes committed by adults towards children is the most horrendous form of criminality. We cannot and we should not accept this as adults, and the report today is a proof that we will not accept it. It's a delicate compromise with a lot of people involved, and I would like to pay tribute to the work of Mrs. Angelilli and her collaborators, the shadows, the coordinators, the Polish and the Hungarian presidency. It's a compromise, and it is true that the Commission would have liked to go further in criminalising child sex tourism, to also include EU habitual residents as well as national in the extraterritorial jurisdiction against abusing children abroad. But the compromise has considerably strengthened the proposal by criminalising child grooming more extensively and adding important provisions on victim protection, providing the right to employers to ask for information on criminal records, and providing for awareness raising and training of professionals as preventive measures. This directive equips us much better than the current one from 2004. On prosecution of offenders, there are 20 criminal offences, including new trends like grooming online, webcam abuse or web viewing child pornography. Different levels of penalties from 1 year to 10 years imprisonment. The elimination of hurdles that may be set by statutes of limitation or confidentiality rules, and special police units specially equipped to identify child victims, which will be a very important investigative tool. On child tourism, there is extraterritorial jurisdiction for nationals, the removal of procedural hurdles and the prohibition of organising travels or advertising opportunities to abuse children. There is extensive assistance to protect the victims with an individual assessment of each child. There will be a risk assessment for convicted offenders and intervention programmes, as well as education, awareness training, etc., to detect child sexual abuse. On images of sexual abuse of children on the internet, we have agreed on the removal of web pages hosted in member states, action to have them removed abroad, and the possibility of blocking, subject to transparent procedures. Again, I would like to thank the Parliament for your true commitment to this. It has been a difficult journey, but I think we have skillfully navigated in this complicated file. With this, we show that our collective aim is to protect children, and we do not tolerate children to be used as objects to satisfy the sexual needs or greeds of adults. So thank you very much for your hard work in this.
Thank you, Commissioner. I turn now to Mrs. KAMMEREVERT. You have 1 minute.
Ja, vielen Dank, Herr Präsident.
Thank you, President. Colleagues, sexual abuse and sexual violence committed against children and young people are certainly one of the worst possible offences one can commit against young people. So the objective has got to be to protect victims, prosecute perpetrators, and make sure that they are prosecuted. I think it's very good that we have found a way to fight against this crime together. We've got a common basis here. In the Cultural Committee, we looked at the question of prevention, but also we looked at solving these crimes, more competencies, and the questions of deletion rather than blocking. And I think it's good that now we can see that we have made some progress here across Europe. The Commission wanted to see blocking as mandatory for all member states, but it doesn't really help any single child to simply pull the curtains together, as it were, because it's easy to circumvent these measures. It doesn't actually make any contribution to fighting sexual crimes. Quite the contrary, it sets up infrastructures, or helps to set up infrastructures to counteract these proposals. So now we've managed to assert ourselves on this point, and I hope that other people will follow suit in following our reasoning, because it's important that we make progress there.
Next is Mrs. YANNAKOUDAKIS, and you have 1 minute.
Thank you. We all share the responsibility of protecting children, and I congratulate the rapporteur on a report that is both sensitive and firm in its approach. I led on this report with the Women's Rights Committee and believe our support of the Commissioner's 3P approach, prevention, protection and prosecution, strengthens this report. Prevention is always the best form of protection. I am pleased that the report has included in it consideration of implementing an EU-wide telephone helpline. In the United Kingdom, we have a successful helpline run by a charity called the Lucy Faithfull Foundation. The helpline offers support and counselling to prevent sexual abuse and protect children at risk. One of the most controversial challenges addressed in this report was the blocking and deletion of child pornography content online. I support deletion of images and subsequent investigation by the police. Everything should be done to stop people accessing illegal images, including blocking. We need to ensure a zero-tolerance approach to child pornography. We need to take a child-centred approach. A society that protects the vulnerable, such as children, is one we must strive for.
Thank you very much. And that concludes the speakers of opinions. Now we turn to the speakers for the groups, and the first is Mr. BUSUTTIL, and you have 2 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. I would like to speak about the law on sexual abuse of children. I would like to thank Ms. Roberta ANGELILLI for her excellent work. I think we all agree that children are vulnerable citizens, and so they need our protection, which goes beyond normal levels of protection. In the past years, we have seen many cases of sexual abuse on various levels all around Europe and the world. These cases are truly shocking. However, they also served to raise awareness on this problem and its dimension. There is a huge need for law to protect children, and we need to do something immediately. Sexual abuse of children has always existed, but now we are aware of it. However, in the past we did not have the internet, and apart from all the progress and all the good things it has brought, it has also brought new possibilities of how children may be abused and exploited. Through the internet, where children are not protected, those who want to abuse children may do so freely. The internet also permits the mass distribution of pornographic material. This law that we will be voting on is a clear message that this abuse needs to stop. This law that we will be adopting will defend children as they should be defended and protected. As a member of this Parliament, I will be voting in favour of this directive. As a father of 2 sons, I will be proud to do so. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I turn to Mrs. Göncz, and you have 1.5 minutes.
Thank you, President. I also welcome this text from the Commission, which is supposed to combat the abuse of children through new technologies. This is an ever greater danger. Pornographic content which can be achieved from the internet, often downloaded and in fact you can use the internet, you can use even a mobile phone to download pornographic content. Our committee in 2010 already demanded that pornographic material be deleted from the internet, and we also wanted rules to be adopted on this. We wanted measures to be drafted and adopted that would make it possible to guarantee that victims would be helped, and also so that we could get more media attention to these problems. Victims need to be protected in such a way that they don't become victims a second time through being traumatized by court cases. 200,000 Eastern European children and women are actually being forced into prostitution every year. These figures concerning trafficked women and children, well, these figures are not going down. In fact, the crisis is ensuring that the figures go up. I emphasise this in the Women's International Lobby. Thank you.
I now turn to Mrs. Griesbeck, and you have 1.5 minutes.
Monsieur le President, colleagues, Commissioner, of course, I also thank all of the colleagues who drafted this fine text, which is this directive that's being presented to us today. And I'd like to add that I'm very pleased to see this firm political expression here that's contained in the text, having succeeded in striking a balance between things so that we really can protect children around Europe by combating exploitation and sexual abuse of children. Now, finding a balanced solution in a technological world which is very advanced, which of course contains many miracles but also contains many serious risks for everybody, and especially for children, is something which we have succeeded with. We're protecting them by removing these internet sites at source with child porn material, or blocking them when we cannot remove them. Now, Commissioner, you indicated all the measures that could be considered priorities for protection of children in Europe and the priorities of our political agenda, realizing that between 10 and 20% of children around Europe are victims of sexual abuse, that about 19 million children in this economic recession, which is probably going to last, 19 million children are exposed to risks of poverty in Europe, and I'm very pleased to hear what you said. And you talked about the Hague Convention and indirectly of the legislation facilitating the implementation of legal decisions, court decisions, and I would like to draw your attention to the difficulties that double nationality couples run into in the implementation of judgments concerning custody of children, especially with the problem in Germany. Thank you.
Monsieur le Président.
Thank you. Next is Mr. Kirkhope, and you have 2.5 minutes.
Mr. President, Madam Commissioner, in an era of rapid and apparently effortless global communications, particularly through the internet, but also now through mobile phones and iPads and the like, it is vital that we in the European Parliament work ever harder to protect children and young adults from the continuing threat of sexual and violent abuse. We as lawmakers have a responsibility to make laws and policies which protect and promote the interests of the most vulnerable in our society. Children, for instance, should not be viewed merely as small adults. In fact, they are not always capable of asking for help or even knowing when they have been wronged. It is therefore the adults in society who must take responsibility for these children and be their strong and robust advocates. I've been working on this issue for many years, first as a minister in the UK Home Office, involved in the UN Convention on Children's Rights, the meeting in Stockholm in Sweden in 1996, and then as rapporteur to a previous European parliamentary report back in 2000 to combat child pornography on the internet. I called for stronger preventative measures to tackle this menace, and I asked member states that they should work with each other, the law enforcement agencies and units such as Europol, to make sure that illegal websites were closed down and perpetrators brought to justice. There was a very similar backbone to Mrs. Angelilli's report, it does concern me that despite the legislative, financial and specialist input into this problem, millions of children across the EU are still at risk today. The violation of children's rights must be stopped, so I am pleased that the ECR Group and my government in the UK are supportive of the aims and proposals of this directive, which goes even further than what I proposed in 2000. I am grateful for the work that Mrs Angelilli and others from the Women's and Culture Committees have done in this area. I particularly welcome proposals to introduce a new offence aiming to criminalise online grooming. I am also pleased this report advocates a more robust approach to criminal checks on professionals who want to work with children and encourages member states to take the necessary steps to ensure that children who report abuse from within their own family are protected. I would like to conclude my remarks by referring to the comments made by the British Prime Minister recently. At an event in London last week, which I attended, he reiterated that child trafficking and child exploitation was inexcusable and had to be stopped. Although this dossier finally doesn't deal specifically with child trafficking, I believe there is a political will at UK and EU level to continue our efforts to work on behalf of children and act as their advocates. They are our future, Mr. President. They are entitled to grow up free of these threats.
I now turn to Mrs Lambert, and you have 2 minutes.
Thank you, President. My group would also like to thank the rapporteur and the other shadows for the good cooperation in difficult negotiations. I think whilst we certainly welcome the offence of online grooming being created, I must admit we found the attitude of Council in not wanting to incorporate grooming in all senses into this on the grounds that that already exists in national legislation a little surprising, given that many of the other offences here also exist in national legislation. My group too welcomes the inclusion for the first time in EU legislation of sex tourism related to children and the jurisdiction over nationals travelling for the purposes of child abuse. But we also agree with the Commission that it is a pity that we haven't been able to find a solution on those enjoying habitual residence. We also welcome the recognition of the need to deal with the associated advertising and facilitation of such travel. We too welcome the measures to deal with the exclusion of convicted offenders from employment involving direct and regular contact with children. We welcome the moves to make it possible for possible employers to request information about the potential employees for professional or organised voluntary activities with children, according to national law. Article 25 relating to websites was particularly difficult to negotiate, as has already been said, and obviously the priority must be to protect children. However, there are legitimate concerns that measures employed for this crucial purpose become co-opted for other purposes of state control, and the solution reached in this directive is important and has the full support of my group. We also welcome the support for survivors, knowing the tragic consequences that such abuse has for so many children throughout their lives. And finally, we welcome the recognition too of the difference for consensual sexual activity between young people, whom we don't want to criminalise for what may be foolish behaviour, but is certainly not exploitative. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I turn to Mr. Triantafyllidis, and you have 1.5 minutes.
Thank you very much. As previous speakers have already said, an agreement between the Parliament and the Council is something that contains many positive elements, and my group is also in favour of these things, fighting sex tourism for one thing, but many others too. But my group isn't particularly pleased with the report, the definitive report. But what I would like to do is to congratulate the rapporteur because of the report, but I want to tell you why we can't approve of the report. First of all, because of the legal basis, the current directive, from a criminal point of view, cannot possibly encompass protection protection for victims. It's simply talking about criminal penalization. And then a lot of de facto abuse cases or other forms of abuse in terms of pornography or passing on pornographic images, that will continue to happen. And then thirdly, in European law, access to certain websites is supposed to be banned, but that would be a precedent. That would set a precedent, and that also counteracts the current legal situation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now turn to Mr. Salavrakos, and you have 1.5 minutes.
President, thank you. There's no doubt that we should be defending the innocence of our children, and we should carry on scientific research into sexual education. We need to protect children from sexual violence that can affect their psyches and leave traces for the rest of their lives. We want children to be psychologically balanced, and that means that you have to create balanced societies. But unfortunately, what we see is many phenomena of violence. We see examples of violence in school and outside school, violence against children within the school, and then violence perpetrated against children in the family. And similarly dangerous phenomena have actually reached a tremendous scope, because violence is now actually being sort of fostered on the internet, violent behaviour, and this sort of development leads us to understand that it's very difficult to actually pinpoint online crime. And there are plenty of traps for luring children into chat rooms and websites, and so we have to provide good information to children, to youngsters, so that they can understand what these traps are, so that they can be ready and they can be wise when they surf the internet. So we welcome this regulation on the sexual abuse of children and on condemning child pornography. The idea is to come up with pan-European legislation. So I congratulate the rapporteur, and I will fully support her proposal. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And the last speaker on behalf of the groups is Mrs. Dodds, and you have 1.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. President. I welcome this report into the sexual abuse and exploitation of children. In Northern Ireland, my constituency, recent figures show us that 18% of all of the children on the Child Protection Register are under a category that includes sexual abuse. It is therefore vital that we enhance the protection of these children, especially in the face of new challenges posed by global communications which transcend national boundaries. With more children having access to the internet and social networking sites, it has become easier for sex offenders to prey on their young victims. In the United Kingdom, internet service providers such as BT are active in helping to combat the issue of online child exploitation, whereby they voluntarily block inappropriate sites. Although this is a step in the right direction, it must be highlighted that many of these sites are hosted outside of member states and not possible to take down. And I would like to see agreements in place that target such websites on a global scale. This is an area where member states can and must act for the common good. Whilst we discuss the current threats facing children as a result of ever-evolving channels of communication, I would also like to remind this House of the many children, now adults, across Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland who have been the victims of horrific historical, clerical and institutional child abuse, stretching back many decades into the past. Just last month, the establishment of an inquiry into historical institutional abuse was launched in Northern Ireland. For these victims of child sex abuse, their issues are as real today as when they first happened, and we must support them too.
Thank you. We now move to the individual speakers, and firstly, Mrs. Striffler for 2 minutes, please.
Thank you, President. Commissioner, first of all, I would like to congratulate you because children's rights have become an integral part of fundamental rights defended by the European Union thanks to the coming into force of the Lisbon Treaty. It is necessary for any policy of the European Union which directly affects or indirectly affects children should be drafted and followed up in the free interest of the child in accordance with fundamental rights guaranteed in the Charter. However, I would like to talk about the particular attention that the European Union should grant to children's rights given the new technologies, which can be a means for facilitating the meeting between a pedophile and his victim, but it can also be a vector for disseminating child porno content. So the European Union has to provide a strong answer with no concessions to these two dangers. Concerning the dangers linked to the utilization of Internet by children, I consider that prevention has to be at the very heart of our policies. It's our duty to educate children about online environments, and therefore the European Union has to draft a real preventive policy adapted to our younger citizens in order to train children of the risks they run when they use the Internet. The use of Internet has to be safer and more adapted to the expectations of children. And in line with this prevention policy, the Member States have to combat new forms of abuse and sexual exploitation like grooming, which is the online solicitation of children for sexual acts of an adult who, hiding behind false information, endeavors to commit a crime. And I'd like to talk about the combating of child pornography on the Internet. We have to remove these sites with this content, and we have to do our utmost to be able to remove these sites as quickly as possible. And I'd like to conclude by saying that if this removal took too long, especially in third countries, a temporary solution should be established to block access to these sites in the severe interest of the child victims of these atrocities.
Thank you. Now, Mrs. Sippel for 2 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, President. The directive on the combating of the sexual abuse of children and children's pornography really sends out a clear message. This topic is a really important pan-European issue, and what we need are uniform rules throughout Europe for definition of offences and definition of penalties. We need to work together to prosecute these offences which are committed abroad outside the European Union. This is necessary as well, and we also need common standards so that we can prosecute legal persons. And here, I think, in the directive, we have seen these penalties set out. But an important point is for committing offences on the Internet. We need to prosecute and criminalise grooming, but more important than that is that all Member States should be obliged to delete Internet websites containing child pornography content. Above and beyond that, there's still an important demand which is addressed to all institutions of the European Union. When it comes to their international cooperation with other countries of the world, they have to guarantee that in third countries the principle of deletion is given priority. There's a lot of abuse taking place in daily life, around children in their daily lives, and so preventive measures are very important, but also we've got to ensure that children learn through the media, and when children use the new media, they are then well advised and know how to avoid danger and recognise danger. And I think what's also important are protective measures for children who are involved in legal cases, but also special support for children and their families outside the legal proceedings. Here the Member States, I think, have considerable duties, but I think after difficult negotiations we've got a good directive. After this has been adopted, it's up to the Member States then to transpose and implement these rules as effective and rapidly as possible. And I'd like to make a personal comment at the end. Even if there is another decision, I would have liked that in the future, in all directive, that there be correlation tables. I know a different decision has been taken, but correlation tables do give us an idea of what's happening in the different Member States. I think it's very disappointing that we don't have those tables.
Baroness Ludford for 1.5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Madam President. The EU has a good story to tell about its work to protect children. Earlier this year, in the strengthened law on trafficking, we included a requirement to appoint a guardian for unaccompanied child victims, which hopefully will help to stop their disappearance from care and back to the clutches of the trafficking gangs. The new directive will mean child sex abusers and porn merchants would face a greater prospect of life behind bars. MEPs rightly fought for tougher sentences. It's also very important that we successfully insisted on the ability to prosecute EU citizens who go abroad as sex tourists. I heard horror stories on this on a visit to Cambodia a few years ago. Among many other initiatives, I would mention mutual recognition of disqualifications from working with children, cross-border exchange of criminal records so abusers can be tracked when they move, and particular protection of child victims and suspects in the criminal justice system. But I would like to say a word about something Commissioner Malmström mentioned, which was the 116000 number for missing children. It's still not operational in, I think, 11 member states, although that was required by last May. In addition, there are problems with using mobile phones outside one's home country because there is a dispute about who picks up the roaming charges. And I would urge Commissioner Malmström to get to grips with this problem and talk to the mobile phone companies, indeed all the phone companies, and try and resolve this problem of the roaming charge, because until that's sorted out, we will not have a universal hotline for missing children.
Thank you. Mr. Tomaszewski for 2 minutes, please.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Sexual abuse of children is a special offence which leaves deep traces in the psyche of the children. The national legislations provide for certain sanctions against the abuse of children, but we have to improve that. The report by colleague Angelilli is a good step in this direction. That is why the legislation have to be amended in a way that perpetrators from the EU should be persecuted even if the sexual crime was carried out outside the EU borders. Organizations fighting pedophilia have to be supported. Support is also needed for citizen initiatives where the justice system is ineffective, corrupt, or involved in sexual abuse of children. A scandal of pedophilia in Lithuania, which took place 3 years ago, is an example of that. The case involved high officials from the justice system, and the resolution of the case was only possible through a citizen initiative. And dear colleagues, it is also important to introduce a more simple access to legal protection for the children and their parents. This is very important. When we talk about people living in poverty, because as we know, this social group is most vulnerable when we deal with sexual abuse of children. We shouldn't forget that our duty is ensuring protection for children. Thank you.
And now Mr. Albrecht for 2 minutes, please.
Thank you, Madam President. Colleagues, Commissioner Malmström, the directive that we're going to be voting on soon is a very important step, and it's the right step towards preventing the exploitation of children in the EU and worldwide. And that's why we welcome most warmly that we've got a good consensus between the Council and the Parliament, particularly when it comes to this sensitive issue, namely fighting the abuse of children. It's essential to send out the right signals and give out the right political answers. We've had lengthy debates, and we've clearly acknowledged that the deletion of pornographic content has got to be done. It's got to be a priority, and it's got to be obligatory, and that's why it's important that we have asserted ourselves that mandatory blocking is not the right way forward. because that doesn't help the situation. If you simply set up a warning sign in cyberspace, it's not going to help the situation, because exploitation and abuse will continue and rape will continue in the real world. It simply pushes things even more further under the carpet. So we have got to take more stringent measures within the EU, in the member states, but also when it comes to third countries. We've got to make sure that we tackle this at the very roots. The criminal statistics show that most activities don't happen in some kind of faraway island in the Pacific, but here or in Russia or places much closer to home. We have got to ensure, therefore, that we have effective methods that are going to help to fight this problem. If we adopt this directive tomorrow, then it's very important for the legal situation in the internet. Instead of having rather dubious infrastructure regulations and relying on the providers, we in the EU want to set up a really good framework to fight abuse where it happens, at the very source. We don't want to delude ourselves or close our eyes to the problem. We've got to ensure that society remains aware of these problems, and we make sure that we have very good measures to fight this problem, and that's why we congratulate you on the effort so far. Thank you.
A minute and a half, please.
Grazie, Presidente.
Thank you, President. Dear colleagues, I'd like to thank Mrs. Angelilli above all for the initiative. The sexual abuse of children is one of the most depraved offences that you could commit. Anyone who abuses a child for sexual purposes has to receive severe punishment. But we also need to act against those people who go to other countries where it's easier to pay for sexual services from children. These children living in dreadful situations of poverty, and in fact their families are so poor that they sell them. And then the dissemination of paedopornographical material on the internet should be banned, and the competent authorities should be able to block these websites that provide such material and put it on the line. And in fact, if you go on the internet, you often come across sites which contain pornographic material, and it's difficult to distinguish whether the people in the pictures are adult or children. I think it would be good if there could be targeted campaigns, so those people who come across these possibly child pornographic sites, they should be able to notify them to the competent authorities. There should perhaps be a dedicated site where you could actually notify of this suspect website. The competent authorities to then check whether the site concerned is a site that should then be blocked or deleted. I'm in favour of this report because I think this is a report that has to be dealt with very carefully, and we have to do our utmost to protect children.
Mr. Griffin, for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. My constituency is suffering a hidden epidemic of sexual grooming, so I appreciate the efforts of all those involved in producing this report. But grassroots campaigners for the protection of children tell me that the report misses the most important target. To concentrate on online pornography while relegating real-life child sexual abuse to a page 33 annex is to worry about a speck in one eye while ignoring a splintered plank in another. Real-life abuse is described in the report as offline grooming. Such terminology is an insult to the victims and their families. It is not offline, it is on our streets. It's not a matter of images, it's a matter of real-life degradation, gang rape.
You are speaking too quickly for the interpreters. Could you possibly slow down a little? Microphone. Your microphone is now not on. Still not on, I think.
It is.
Okay.
Would it be okay to go back to that previous paragraph?
We have stopped the clock, yes.
Thank you. To concentrate on online pornography while relegating real-life child sexual abuse to a page 33 annex is to worry about a speck in one eye while ignoring a splintered plank in another. Real-life abuse is described in the report as offline grooming. Such terminology is an insult to the victims and their families. It is not offline, it is on our streets. It's not a matter of images, it's a matter of real-life degradation, gang rape, and even murder. But because a disproportionately large number of street groomers are Muslims, politically correct censorship prevents the issue from being properly discussed. Because of this deliberate downplaying of the problem, On-street grooming is not even a specific offence in many countries. As a result, the crime remains statistically virtually invisible. This undermines attempts to secure justice for the victims, effective responses from the authorities, and proper penalties for the perpetrators. In my own constituency, the family of Charlene Downs still wait for justice following the botched prosecution of those arrested over the grooming, rape and murder of their little girl in 2003. Despite their belief that 60 other girls had been groomed by the same gang and that Charlene's body was disposed of in kebabs, the police regarded their report as too sensitive to publish. The consequences of such cowardice become clear 4 years later when 15-year-old Paige Chilvers went missing, believed murdered, at the hands of the same gang. Of course, not all police officers are politically correct cowards, any more than all Muslims are groomers. The vast majority are as sickened by these things as we are. But the playing down of the problem in reports like this aids the criminal minority and leaves new victims at risk. The more serious crime should get the attention. Thank you.
Mrs. Verheyen.
Vielen Dank, Frau Präsidentin. Thank you, Madam President. I'm very pleased that we've succeeded with this report now to come up with a sustainable and an effective directive, and I'd like to thank everybody for that. The directive is a very important step forward in fighting the abuse of children, but still we shouldn't forget one very important aspect, namely most of the crime happens in the very small environment, in other words within the child's family, in schools, among acquaintances. It's very close to home, and that's why we've got to make sure that our children become strong to, when it's a serious situation, to actually talk to somebody, a person of their confidence, and also to be aware of potential problems and the dangers and what grooming is all about. People have got to become more sensitive to being able to handle the media. Our children have got to be more sensitive to the issues, and we've got to make them aware of the problems. A lot of parents don't even know what's possible with mobile telephony or with the internet today. And so our parents have got to be informed as well. It's important that the report focuses on prevention as well. The authorities, the schools, families, parents have got to do everything they can to prevent these crimes from happening in the first place. And that's why we need to ensure that we have a better negotiating framework between the EU and third countries, the USA or Russia or whatever, because then we can only ensure that this content is deleted as quickly as possible, and we need to cooperate very closely with other states to make sure we're sending out a clear signal in terms of fighting these crimes. Once the perpetrator has been found, then often there is a long delay, and often this person is simply acquitted or is not prosecuted quickly enough. So the public debate has got to be continued on this. We've got to focus also on prosecution and conviction. There's the aspect of protection of the victims, deletion before blocking, intensive scientific documentation of cases. These things have all got to happen even after the vote tomorrow. We can't possibly sit back and relax now. Quite the reverse. We have got to ensure that we continue to fight for prevention and the solving of these crimes.
You try to respect your speaking time. We don't have so much extra time to play with. Mrs. Blinkevičiūtė, for 2 minutes, please.
Thank you, Madam President. Today we are considering a very important report, our common effort. Sexual abuse of children is a horrendous crime which is being committed against children. They experience physical, emotional, psychological trauma which they experience throughout their lives, and this hinders their personal development. These crimes are also dirty business which brings profit to the offenders. Therefore, it is vital that we should implement this directive and introduce more stringent penalties for such crimes. This way, the member states will not be able to come up with weaker penalties. We need to prosecute the offenders. A very significant part in this directive is devoted to prevention, namely education, training of specialists, cooperation with different civic institutions and organizations. We need to educate children and parents about risks related to the internet. Psychological support is needed for the victims and their families. And in the investigation, the cooperation of the police forces and different institutions is vital so that the children receive sufficient and effective support. Well-trained psychologists, social workers and lawyers need to be involved into this procedure, especially in the prevention and protection of victims. I do agree with the colleagues who have spoken in favor of all EU member states being committed to delete the pornographic content, which means that our common efforts within the EU and with the third countries could bring along good results. Thank you.
Mr. Alvaro for a minute and a half.
Thank you very much, Madam President, Commissioner, President in Office of Council. The sexual abuse of children is a crime. It's dreadful. It's a disgrace, and it's something that we shouldn't tolerate. Today we're finding together the best way of dealing with this problem. I'd like to thank the rapporteur a great deal, and I thank the Commissioner as well for the efforts that she's been making. I thank you for trying to get a common position in this House. We think we should delete websites rather than block them. We agree on that principle. We also agree that we want to completely get rid of child pornography material on the web. And if member states can't achieve that, then they should block instead. But really, we don't want to draw a veil over what exists. We want to look at the root causes, attack the problem at the roots. And this is what I think we can do with this directive, especially thanks to the work that the colleagues have put into it. But we also have to look at international negotiations. Mr. Albrecht just mentioned this. A lot of these pages, these websites come from outside Europe. And you can't have these phishing sites disappearing more quickly from the websites than child pornography sites. We have got to ensure that all member states and third countries should not eschew their responsibilities. They just can't look the other way. We've also got to find who is behind this. We've got to find the ringleaders, find the organisers, and deal with the users. And after that, protect our children. Thank you.
Mr. Van Dalen for 2 minutes, please.
Madam President, tomorrow we're voting on a very important directive fighting sexual abuse and exploitation of children and child pornography. These scandals need to be stopped, and that's why I support the report. I'd like to draw attention to 3 points. First of all, cooperation. Criminal gangs responsible for sexual exploitation often work across the borders, so the cooperation between the judicial authorities and police can help a great deal here. These penalties that are going to be carried out should be applicable across the board. Sometimes there are very small criminal bands or gangs, and it's the same thing as well, that if crimes are sort of more minor, they're not minor, but what we need to do is make sure that it's not possible for these gangs to carry out their work. And then another thing, with Mr. Bourzoy, I organised a seminar on trafficking in humans. There were people from all different countries. There are organisations that help victims of sexual abuse and exploitation. Various different authorities don't really do anything. In Hungary and Romania, women and children that are victims don't really get much support. But Article 18 says that member states have got to help underage victims. There are various different women's refuge houses in Europe, sometimes accommodate people of less than 16 years old, and so it's important that this help of victims need to be made very important indeed, and more attention needs to be drawn to that particular aspect. Now, defence as well. This isn't dealt with a lot. I support the rapporteur that calls on national authorities to do more for prevention. The question to the Commission is, what are the Member States going to hold themselves to account in terms of prevention? How are we going to make them call themselves to account?
For a minute and a half, please.
Thank you, President. Dear colleagues, committing sexual abuse affecting children is disgraceful. It's the most barbaric thing you can imagine. But apart from the actual act, violence against young people has devastating consequences on the development the individual. And it's not by chance if many adults who actually commit abuse were subject to abuse themselves when they were children. So it's right to be as severe as possible in punishing this sort of crime. But too often this sort of abuses are committed against children with disabilities or people with a mental incapacity, which makes the crime even worse. And I'd like to stress one aspect of this directive: the prevention measures and then the voluntary measures. One of the solutions to be adopted would involve chemical castration. Italy, this topic hasn't yet been dealt with, but in some European countries this is already being used, and this chemical castration has given rise to good results. So I think we've got to perhaps go in that direction, even though in my view, with the most serious cases, this sort of treatment shouldn't be voluntary but should be mandatory.
Mrs. Gál, for 2 minutes.
Tisztelt elnök asszony! 4 gyermekes anyaként
Thank you, Madam President. As a mother of 4 children, it's extremely important to me, and I'm very pleased that we are taking action at European level against this scandalous and despicable crime. This type of crime is perpetrated across the board, and we've got to put a stop to it. I would like to thank Mrs. Malmström for her initiative, and I'd also like to thank the Hungarian presidency. And I'd also like to congratulate the Polish presidency, because after many years now, it's been able to wrap up this project. And I would like to thank Mrs. Angelilli as well. I hope that the Member States are going to implement this directive as soon as possible. You know, well, we know that the implementation of this directive is not going to be able to completely eliminate child pornography. Every single initiative is welcome. Every single initiative that's going to get rid of illegal websites, ones that have child pornography, and the people behind these websites need to be found and prosecuted. Anyone that has anything to do with these crimes, whether directly or indirectly. I'd like to point out the dangers inherent in access to modern technology. This is a danger to our children, so the children need to be aware of it, but also their carers, parents. They've got to be informed. We can't sit back now, and we've got to continue our work. New technologies change all the time. We've got to keep up with this. Children should get priority all over the EU.
Over for a minute and a half, please.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, Madam Commissioner. Sexual violence, sexual abuse of children and child pornography represent a significant abuse of basic rights, especially the right for protection and care, which is crucial for its development, as it is stated in the UN documents and in the Charter of the Basic Rights. Innocent victims are facing long-term physical and also mental pain. I would like to underline the fact that the very basic nature of this crime undermines the basic values of modern society, especially in the field of protection of children, and also weakens the trust into state institutions, but also European institutions. Therefore, I'm convinced that such heavy crimes need a complex joint approach on the European level, which also includes proceedings against the perpetrators and protection for children. We should, however, make sure that we will take all the necessary preconditions in order to avoid such criminal aims which are committed on minors. When carrying out any repressive measures, we should make sure that in all conditions we will keep in mind, first of all, the basic intentions and basic good intentions of the child, and also the future development of a child in line with the adopted documents and also the general morale. However, if we come upon such type of criminality, we shouldn't be afraid to publicly target such people, including representatives of Catholic Church.
ZIOBRO for 1 minute, please.
Madam Chair, ladies and gentlemen, it is with great satisfaction that I'm accepting the fact that the European Parliament is dealing with a very important document aimed at combating sexual exploitation, those who are most vulnerable. We are ready to do everything and anything in order for children to feel much safer in Europe, because it is the world of the Internet, the world related to permissivisms and the dissemination of a very free attitude to sexual life exceed certain limits. These limits and constraints have been delineated by those vulnerable ones, and that is why this directive should actually lead to the adoption of more severe penalization of crimes with certain severe sanctions. Yes, such crimes should be severely penalized, and it should be consistently investigated as well as criminalized. We need to combat the Internet pathology, and that is why it is very important to note that these elements have been very well noted in the directive. Thank you.
For 2 minutes, please.
I would like to say to Mrs. Angelilli straight away that I think she's done an excellent piece of work, and her task wasn't easy, trying to find a balanced position on an important directive, and we give her our full support. Well, this debate on such a sensitive issue, and a debate on these most dreadful crimes committed against young people is very difficult. Children are fragile and children are vulnerable and weak, and these sexual crimes against young people must be subject to very stringent and severe punishment. And then when it comes to blocking websites where it's not possible to first delete websites containing child pornographic material, then I think it's important to achieve that. But it's also important to talk about child trafficking and people trafficking that's often organised by international organised crime groups. We need to discuss this with third countries. We know that often these young people who are trafficked disappear completely. They disappear without trace. They're abducted. Now, if we can rescue these children, then we have to ensure their rehabilitation. We have to try to ensure that they are socially reintegrated, and we need an early warning system. We need more member states to implement the rules on the early warning system. What we need also is ever greater cooperation based on the trust between member states. It's important there's a reference here to confiscation of the proceeds of crime. We need to take away the profits of those who've been convicted of these crimes. We need to have we also have to try to rehabilitate the victims, these young victims. This directive is an important stage. It's a stage that we have to go through, but that many more steps will have to be, and stages will have to be gone through by this Parliament.
BOZKURT for 1.5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Kindermisbruik is een nacht.
Child exploitation and abuse is a nightmare for all parents, and of course indescribable for children themselves, for the whole society. In fact, nobody, institutions, nobody can accept this happening. In several EU countries, horrendous things have come to light. In the Netherlands, there's been recently a large-scale abuse case. Somebody that was already prosecuted in Germany went to Amsterdam and worked in a creche without knowing. Nobody knew anything about the previous prosecution. He is using the internet, or was using the internet, and disseminating pictures of abuse, terrible, terrible abuse that he was carrying out with these children. People have got to know about previous convictions. It's important to ensure that checks are properly carried out. They've got to be registers, crime registers, and that's going to be set up in 2012. These have got to be up and running so that these kind of things is prevented. Cross-border abuse and sex tourism are also things that we need to tackle. Nationals that abuse children in other countries and third countries need to be prosecuted as well. Every single online click, every single viewing of a picture of an abused child is another infringement of that child's rights. Online grooming needs to be tackled. We've talked about that. All of these criminal proceedings are very important. We need to make sure that the law is tightened up, and that will help us to achieve a safer Europe for our children.
Material has rapidly been increasing in prevalence on the internet, and the severity of such content is worsening. Indeed, the statistics reveal a truly harrowing story. In the UK, for example, BT Internet alone estimates that their blocking technology prevents 40,000 attempts to access known child abuse websites every single day. That's over 14 million attempts every year. That is why I'm pleased to see the Commission's proposal for a directive on combating this issue. Sadly, there is one aspect which, as well as causing significant controversy, provoked an emotionally charged debate. This, of course, was the issue of blocking versus deletion. No one is suggesting that blocking is 100% effective. However, blocking is quick and crucial short-term disruption tactic. So quite simply, it is my belief that the protection of our children and the apprehension of the criminals who perpetrate these abuses should take precedence over freedom of the internet and the human rights of those sick individuals who view this material. I'm sure that the majority of European citizens will share this belief. The sad truth is that whilst action on the online sphere is valuable, the best way to prevent child abuse images circulating on the internet is to stop child abuse, full stop. And I would like to ask members of this House to disregard the implications inferred from the statement from Mr. Griffin. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Diaz de Mera for 2 minutes.
Thank you, President. Well, the draft directive has all of my support. This is a great step forward, and the commitment of Mrs. Angelilli to the cause of protecting children is one of the most noble purposes that a member of Parliament can assume. Children are vulnerable, they're weak, and they deserve the greatest protection. Sexual abuse against them has to be prevented with new legislative measures, prosecuted severely in our penal codes, and so-called sex tourism and child porno are forms of exploitation which have to be the primary object of prosecution, including international agreements here. I think all the free trade agreements with third countries and development aid ought to include a clause to protect children. And we also ought to look with concern at the indoctrination of children which carries out in countries of structural poverty, that if the children are children of polygamy, they go to religious schools to get to some. Now, the child soldiers, etc., are one of the most abominable forms of exploitation, a phenomenon we see across social consequences which are irreversible. And the programs to recover the child victims of forced prostitution have to be a political and social priority of the Union. And this line 11600 has to have the total support of all the member states. So I appreciate and applaud the commitment of the Council, but particularly the commitment of Mrs. Malmström and Mrs. Angelilli. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mrs. Papadopoulou for 1 minute, please.
Ευχαριστώ, κυρία Πρόεδρε.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Sexual abuse of children leads to trauma, lifelong trauma actually, for children. Studies have shown this. Studies have shown that 10 to 20% of young people in the EU have experienced violence. The perpetrators are often people in their close environment. In these modern times, we've got all this technology, internet, mobile phones, and so on and so forth. There are many websites with child pornography, and their number is actually on the increase. Victims are becoming younger and younger. They are being abused by paedophiles. Their victims are becoming younger. We are focusing here on a European action framework here to prevent child abuse and exploitation. And for that reason, I'd like to thank Mrs. Angelilli and congratulate her, because in this directive she has taken on board a lot of the Council of Europe's Charter on the Protection of Children. It talks about grooming, it talks about seizing pornographic material, and so on and so forth, and also the blocking of websites. I hope that we are all going to vote in favour of this directive. We want zero tolerance when it comes to abuse children.
Please try to keep to your time. We have a large number of people who want to speak under Catch the Eye, and some of them won't get the chance if you all keep overrunning. Mrs. Nedelcheva for 2 minutes, please.
Thank you, President. Commissioner, dear colleagues, I'm very pleased today to be able to bring all my support to this report, which makes it possible to make considerable progress in terms of protecting child rights. It insists on more prevention and introduces stricter penalties. And I'd like to emphasize the importance of penalizing more strictly people having utilized their position of authority, confidence, or influence to abuse a child. The report also emphasizes the provision supporting victims and their families. I'm saying and their families because they're also victims, indirect victims maybe, but they can also experience sexual violence committed against one of their children as a profound injury. So we're making considerable progress with this directive, and I would really like to congratulate the rapporteur on her work. Beyond certain divergences of opinion, which we saw during the negotiations, we always wanted to put at the heart of our concerns the supreme interest of the child, and I think we have to emphasize that today. However, I have to admit that there's one thing that leaves a bitter taste in my mouth, and that doesn't directly concern Mrs. Angelilli's report. It's a more general report. Madam Commissioner, why are you not in favor of the EU joining the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child? I submitted a written question on the subject, other colleagues have done it too. Now that the Union has the legal personality making it possible to ratify international treaties, can we not go further in recognizing children's rights? The argument you put forward of saying that the Union isn't competent to intervene here is not good enough. This legalistic response is not viable. The ratification by the Union is a strong political message that we must send. If the European Union undertakes to get to children's rights respected, then the ratification of the Convention is necessary. All the more so as we now have the Charter of Fundamental Rights and its Article 24, which obliges us to get these rights respected. The European Union has to be more courageous and fully assume its new responsibilities.
Thank you. Mr. Scurria for 2 minutes, please.
Thank you, President. Oh, I really don't think you can classify crime. All offences are equally hideous, but the crimes we're talking about this evening are particularly dreadful. It's in fact not by chance that one of the most difficult pages in the Bible is where Jesus says that if you have really upset or hurt a child, then you should have stones put around your neck, and you should be dropped into the bottom of the sea. Now, I think today we can say that we can be happy with the work we've done. There's thanks to our rapporteur, Mrs. Angelilli, and thanks to the other European institutions, the Commission and the Council, we are launching an important piece of legislation with measures against sexual tourism, with the clear definition of offences relating to the sexual abuse of children, combating of child pornography, and we ought to also define aggravating circumstances. We talk about how we can confiscate the proceeds of these crimes, and we promote prevention, and this law contains that and many other things. And in these days where we see that politics can't find any answers, in this particular case we see that politics can find answers. I thank those volunteers who deal with these problems every day, and I thank the police as well, who do a very difficult and delicate job in some countries, starting in mine, where I think the police forces have actually developed best practice and set a good example. Today we need to breathe life into a European strategy. This way our citizens will feel that Europe is close to them in tackling such dramatic problems, and I think that with pride we can say that just for once we've done a good job.
For 2 minutes, please.
I welcome Mrs. Angelilli's initiative to resume discussion on this theme. I am glad to see that Mrs. Angelilli has always been concerned with child protection, and I want to congratulate her for that. I asked to take the floor during this debate because unfortunately my country, Romania, has been mentioned in a recent EU Kids Online study as a high-risk country. This study has been made with the support of the European Commission and refers to the time children spend on the internet unsupervised. Romania is above the 88 minutes per day European average. Therefore, Romanian children are much more exposed to abuse. Cooperation between the member states to fight this phenomenon, especially enforcement, and in order to prevent child abuse, the partnership between police and institutions meant to protect children is essential. Fighting child pornography is very important because this is one of the most frequent IT crimes after stealing of personal information, cyberbullying and fraud. Citizens, ordinary citizens, could contribute by simply signaling any incidents that they might stumble across. For example, in Romania we have a center for disappeared or sexually exploited children. It's called Focus. It has been created in 2007 and it's trying to develop awareness in society concerning these phenomena. This center also administers the hotline where people can report child pornography cases, and this is a hotline which is financed by the European Commission. Finally, I would like to urge the member states to increase cooperation with third countries in order to fight this phenomenon globally. Thank you.
Mr. Becker for 2 minutes.
Sehr geehrte Frau Präsidentin, sehr geehrte
Madam President, Commissioner, the European Parliament, together with the Commission, is showing the interest of the children of Europe. In this report, Mrs. Angelilli's report, it's an excellent example of cross-group cooperation. It's the strongest weapon against child exploitation and abuse that shows us the way forward across Europe but also across the world, and shows that no member state can achieve something by itself. The protection of children needs to be accorded a priority in our political work, and this is a good example of this. This is an excellent report, and the directive itself needs to focus, or in the wake of that directive we will be making sure that there are further steps taken. We need to incorporate and strengthen the preventive aspect, and also the images in the media of children. Whenever there's a suggestion or lascivious poses, dubious poses that are used of children, all of this needs to be stopped. The French program recently showed that 10-year-old girls have been shown in very compromising positions and very suggestive positions. This is all fodder for paedophile rings, and this needs to be prevented. So the images of young girls in magazines, we need to also see that there's a reduction in the threshold of people's tolerance at the moment. The threshold is sinking ever further. We've got to stop this. Of course we have to look at freedom of press, but this has got nothing to do with it. We are focusing first and foremost on preventing crime. So we need to look at publications of images of children, because it can be seen as an incentive arousing certain people's desires. Thank you.
Thank you. Mrs. Mathieu for 2 minutes, please.
Merci, Madame. Thank you, President. First of all, I would like to thank my colleague Roberta ANGELILLI for her remarkable work here, for her perseverance and her competence that have made it possible for us to have a clear text which lays down the basis of the framework for protection of children, thanks to clear, relevant definitions. This recognizes the diversity of situations of abuse and has a framework adapted to each case. No form of violence is left out, and the vulnerability is certainly understood. Internet and its risks are completely incorporated in the report. We can only applaud this harmonization, which makes possible significant progress in prevention and the conviction of people who abuse children. It was high time for the European institutions to take up this subject, to clearly indicate that any exploitation and sexual abuse of children of whatever form is unacceptable. So Mrs. Malmström also deserves our thanks. Now we have to protect our children, who often face abominations that they don't understand. A lot of progress has been made. We have taken account of sexual tourism, even when it takes place outside the European Union, and I think the limitation of child porno sites by removing or blocking them will be by many member states. Our children need the highest amount of protection they can get in whatever their social class. Thank you.
Thank you. Mrs. Skrzydlewska for 2 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman. I think that when we think about children's rights, we should have a broader perspective. Even though there's 90 million children in the EU, they are treated more like subjects than as real participants of the law. They are protected by the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child and various national, but they're not protected enough in real life and in cyberspace. The protection is not coordinated enough. In many countries we talk about lack of education and other aspects, but there's really no coordinating institution. There are in many countries no institution that would provide children with protection when they become victims. The judicial systems are not well developed in many countries to provide children with protection. That needs financial support, and foster families would need to receive assistance. When it comes to disabled children, an early support system should be foreseen. Doctors and medical personnel should be trained to work with those children and to provide them and their families with support. Undoubtedly, what's important here that we do not have an EU fund that would focus on the problems of children. That is why, Madam Commissioner, could you please consider the creation of such a fund? In my opinion, the EU should be at the forefront of protecting children by providing additional regulations and by coordinating cooperation among member states.
Mrs. Matera for 2 minutes.
Grazie.
Thank you, President, Commissioner. The sexual abuse and sexual exploitation of children is something that's actually spreading in the member states of the European Union. This is a very worrying fact, and this is enhanced by the use of new technologies and above all by the use of internet. This sort of violence affects young children of both genders, although most complaints concern abuse of girls. I think it's necessary for the European Union to equip itself with a legislative framework which will allow the European Union to condemn these dreadful acts, and which will lead to the harmonization of criminal legislation, penal legislation of the member states. The recognition of phenomena such as grooming and the introduction of the definition of the offence of sexual tourism and the development of helplines promoted by the member states are a good thing. The blocking of pictures on websites so that young people who are subject to abuse then become repeated victims on these websites or removing these websites. These constitute measures which go in the right direction when we're trying to combat these phenomena. We need to combat them in a very decisive fashion. I'd like to congratulate the rapporteur Roberta ANGELILLI. I finally believe that it's absolutely crucial to support the development of structures that would provide assistance to the victims of these crimes. And I think we also need to find means to re-educate the defendants, re-educate the offenders. And I think we need to look here at the role of women, because women are the main providers of assistance within families and within society. And now, at the moment, we need to toughen up legislation in the member states, and we need to harmonise our legislation on offences and definitions of crimes.
For 2 minutes, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. A crime is a crime, regardless if it's committed physically or on the net. Criminal gangs are organised crimes, regardless of the means they use. Kids deserve our full protection and to feel protected. That's why I have been so committed to this work. They have the right to live in freedom, in security, and also they have the right to the integrity on the net. I'm glad that we could finally unite on adopting common, legislative, concrete measures to truly combat child abuse, as called for, by the way, in the Stockholm programme. There is strong support to enhance prevention, protection and prosecution, and to protect the victim throughout the European Union. Child pornography images, grooming and sex tourism are finally criminalized. I fully embrace freedom of expression, Madam Chair, and freedom on the internet, but that's not the issue now. What we are voting on is to protect innocent children from brutality on the internet, not on limiting the net. It is not about blocking the internet, it's about blocking images that are illegal on the internet. It is not ideology or censorship, it is about violence and exploitation that can traumatize children for the rest of their lives. With this directive, I believe we succeed in toughening the means to combat child abuse without creating a Big Brother society. Member States have to remove pornographic content on web pages hosted in the territory, or to block them when the server is in a third country and removal is not possible. But the directive also provides for transparent procedures and adequate safeguards. We should of course also engage in dialogue with the industry and service providers to make the best use of information technology. And we should also call, and I also call on the IT industry to continue to play their role and be responsible. In this directive and in the European Union Programme for Children, we are finally putting the children at the centre stage of European policy, and we create a culture of zero tolerance. Madam Chair, I would just like to finish, if you allow me, in calling to adopt the nomination in every committee in the Parliament, an MP responsible for children's rights, so we can really unite forces and stand up for children in all our work. Thank you.
Thank you
very much.
Mr. Mikolasic for 2 minutes, please.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, Madam Commissioner, Council, colleagues. According to the data of UNICEF, the child pornography industry is still blossoming. This despiteful is profiting from children, from more than 1 million of children. Sexually abused children and child pornography are a very strong violation to the basic rights of children, which are anchored in the Convention of the UN on the rights of the child and also in the Basic Bill of Rights of the European Union. It is, however, the principle of lawmakers on the European level as well as on the level of member states to take specific measures in order to avoid and prevent such types of serious criminal activity. The obligation to protect the weakest members of the society, the children, clearly needs to be solved by all that we have available in the criminal and penal code. Therefore, we can adopt very harsh measures which need to be adequate, including very long sentences for perpetrators of this type of criminality, which need to be scaled according to the seriousness of the criminality in order to have a discouraging effect. We see a rapid change of this type of criminality in the anonymous conditions of the internet, which very often provokes criminal activities, and we have to be capable of adapting to these new conditions and challenges in order to avoid certain legal vacuums or missing chains. The international type of activities enables the perpetrators to avoid sanctions outside of the European Union, and therefore, according to my opinion, it is crucial to work more on the international cooperation, and therefore I support the idea that the European Commission should initiate discussion to start an international binding agreement. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mrs. Zaborska, for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Madam.
Madam President, Madam Commissioner, Mr. Minister, let me first of all express my gratitude to Madam Angelilli and the Commissioner for very efficient cooperation when we were drafting this directive. The sexual exploitation is the criminal act. There exists only the production of images and photographs. When we take into consideration this fact that then we of course are very much aware of the fact that the blocking of internet pages is not sufficient protection. We have to protect the dignity of the children. We can guarantee that only by removing those images from internet, and blocking should be only used in such cases when it is impossible to erase those images. And the second aspect with respect to combating against this sexual abuse of children, we have to draw the parents into this, because there are parents that are then facing the police officers, the judges, etc. And the reason is that their children are in very difficult situation, and parents are trying to somehow excuse themselves because they are convinced that they simply did not know what their children were doing. But I am asking you, what is the place of the parents? How should they respect and protect the rights of the child? Because this is the aspect that I'm missing in the documents of the European Commission. Parents usually are depicted there as those that are not fulfilling their obligations vis-à-vis children, or, as the case may be, commit sexual abuse or violence.
Debate. And firstly, Mr. Pirker.
Danke, Frau Präsidentin.
Thank you, Madam President, Commissioner, and the representative of the Council. I'm very pleased that we've managed to achieve something here to protect the most vulnerable people in our society, namely children. This is a very worthy package, and it will help to prevent abuse of children. Of course, what we're talking about here, or what's important, is minimal sanctions for child pornography, sex crimes, sex tourism. Travel providers profit indirectly from this kind of thing, from sex tourism, and they need to be punished too. This should be something that is a criminal act in all countries, and it should also apply to crimes perpetrated outside the European Union. The Member States need to be obliged to delete pornographic sites, child pornographic sites, and also block content. I think Mrs. Angelilli's report is an excellent report. Child abuse and child pornography will be well fought using these reports, and the most vulnerable people in society will be better protected. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. În 2009, peste 6 milioane de...
In 2009, over 6 million young people dropped out of school. 17.4% of those only have primary education. That is why one of the priorities of the EU 2020 strategy is the reduction under 10% of school dropout, access to education and preschool care for all children is essential for their future social integration, for their personal development, and for their insertion into the adult life. The EU has as an objective the provision of a high level of protection of children in the cyberspace, and at the same time the protection of children's right to have access to the internet as an instrument for their social and cultural development. The Safer Internet program coordinates and supports efforts to protect children while on the internet at the European Union level. Various sectors of the IT&C industry have been involved in increasing the degree of protection of children who use mobile phones or social networks. I urge the Commissioner to continue the Safer Internet program. Thank you.
Mrs. Prendergast.
The need to adapt our child protection policies to effectively tackle the realities of the 21st century is undeniable. In particular, the possibility to introduce technical blocking mechanisms to prevent individuals from gaining access to online sexually exploitative content depicting a child is a welcome development. It has been said of this policy that it is unproven and that it potentially undermines freedom of information and communication on the internet. Colleagues, in law and in reality there is no such thing as an absolute right or freedom, but instead each freedom is qualified and must be balanced against opposing freedoms. The right to freely communicate does not preclude the need to protect the fundamental rights of children and minors. Secondly, I support this proposal's aim to legislate for victims' rights. This proposal puts victims' rights on a statutory footing and in general encompasses the provision of adequate support to victims before, during and after a criminal investigation. Thank you, Madam.
I know it's difficult, but some of you are speaking quite fast for the interpreters this afternoon. Next, Mr. Kelly.
Any abuse of children is a heinous and appalling, reprehensible act. It has gone on for years, but it is only recently it has come into the public domain, and perhaps no place more than my own country, where reports have highlighted the abuse of children by clergy and members of religious orders, and as a result certain actions are being taken to protect children and to deal with the offenders. And indeed I am pleased to say that the government is introducing a referendum to the constitution to further guarantee the rights of the child. It is good that we are discussing this here today because we can give it a broader dimension, and particularly in terms of bringing legislation on a European wide basis which can guarantee the rights of the child and protect them in the future. We also need though to concentrate on education, and especially in relation to social media, which is being used more and more to attract children into situations where they can be abused.
Mr. Kukan.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Chair. Sexual abuse of children is growing in numbers. It is, however, a very alarming trend. The possible consequences are very threatening, not only for the children but for the society in large. One of the current forms of abuse of children is the spreading of child pornography via internet. Unfortunately, the current legal norms are not sufficient in order to legally fight against this phenomena. Therefore, we have to look for solutions which will stop such distribution of images and video on the internet. We need to identify and block web pages, and also we need to have stricter measures against the perpetrators of these types of crimes. The objections that this will lead to the limitations of freedom of information is irrelevant. This type of activity very often has an international dimension as well. Insufficient presence of mechanisms in order to fight for right and legal protections needs to be replaced by harsher measures on a European level. And we have to increase the coherence of legal systems of the individual member states. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Zogor.
Köszönöm, elnök asszony. A gyermekek szexuális zaklatásának és
Thank you, Madam President. Thank you very much. The exploitation and abuse of children is something that we can't separate from security on the internet. The internet has often led to positive changes in our societies, but in this case, of course, the reverse is true, because child pornography, well, the internet is the perfect tool to disseminate child pornography. We have to think about children in the Central and East European countries as well. In many cases, it's poverty that is at the heart of this as well. Poorer children are more affected and more vulnerable. We need to have a very unified approach to this.
Die Kinderrechte.
Children's rights are part of our Charter of Fundamental Rights, Article 24, and the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child was actually ratified by all 27 member states. Now, the fact that child's rights exist is one thing, their enforcement is another. We have to supervise the respect of these rights. That's very useful, but only 22% of children, according to a poll in 2009, actually even know about their rights. And this is not a helpful situation, because children need to be protected. We need clear and simple framework conditions to be created by the Commission, and through these framework commissions we'll be able to ensure that children who have rights of custody and responsibility for their children, that they actually then shoulder their responsibilities and actually ensure greater protection of their children. I'd like to thank Mrs. Angelilli above all for this report. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going straight now to Commissioner Malmström. Thank you.
Madam President, honourable members, Minister, thank you very much for a most interesting and very important debate. I would like to highlight a few things, because much has been said. Baroness Ludford asked me about the countries who have not acceded to the hotline number 116000. In the revised Universal Service Directive, it says that Member States should have make every effort to access to this by the 25th of May this year, and still 11 countries are not in this hotline. It also says that Member States shall ensure information to the citizens that it exists, and facilitate the services operating to adhere to this. It is up to the Member States to choose how they promote the hotline. But to raise awareness and to allow exchanges of best practices and to identify practical tools, the Commission is organising best practices meetings and high-level meetings with stakeholders, and we will continue to do so every year until all countries have made sure that it is operational. I also got a question from Mrs. Nedelcheva on the Convention of the Rights of the Child. Now, it is more complicated than it might seem to adhere to that, because the European Union can, as you well know, members, only act within the limits of the competence referred to it by the treaties. Moreover, in accordance with the articles in the actual Convention of the Rights of the Child, the instrument is open only to state parties. So for these reasons, the Commission do not envisage to accede to the Convention, but the EU Agenda for the Rights of the Child reaffirms the importance of the Convention, and we do everything to make sure that all EU legislation and proposals are in line with that Convention. I would also like to highlight something that might be a misunderstanding, not opening the debate again, but make very sure that nobody has promoted or proposed or envisaged to do blocking instead of deletion. That has never been an issue. What we should do, and that is very clear in the Commission proposal, and I am very happy for the huge support in this House, Member States shall delete at source. This is the only way to combat child pornography online. We shall delete at source. But we all know that a majority of these horrible sites, and I don't know if you have seen them, but there are toddlers on these sites. They are horrible, and there's a lot of people making huge money every time someone sees those babies being abused. And every time someone looks at it, they are being abused again, again and again. And the majority of these sites are not hosted in the European Union. That's why we propose from the Commission that Member States should block the access until they can be removed at source. Now, in this proposal, it says that Member States may do so. Of course, we must also cooperate with these countries who host the majority of these sites. And we have very active negotiations and talks and collaboration with, for instance, the United States on this. They're moving forward, and also with Russia and other states. Having said this, I think the tool, and Mrs. Angelilli, with the massive support and praising you have got in this plenary from the left to the right, I think you can be very proud of what you have achieved. But we can all be proud, the Council, the Commission, the Parliament and yourself, because with this we give good tools to prevent, to protect and to prosecute people who do these offences. And we also send a very important political signal that sexual abuse of children like this is not accepted, and this is a clear message from the whole of the European Union. So thank you very much for a very important debate and for a very important work.
Thank you, Commissioner. Now, Council.
Pani Przewodnicząca.
Madam Chair, Commissioner, members of the European Parliament, I'm very happy to conclude on this unity of thinking when it comes to combating sexual abuse of children. Today we can say that the way to formally adopting this instrument in the first reading is open to us. I'm also convinced that the compromise that has been worked out with the enormous contribution of the rapporteur shall allow for the adoption of this directive in a very short period of time. It is with great interest that I listened to all those voices and contributions to the discussion. Each and every voice spoke and emphasized the interest of the protection of the child. And I think the situation calls upon us to react on an everyday basis. We have to combat all those threats because most of them are related to the introduction of the new technologies, including that of the Internet. And that is why with this directive that we will be in a position to radically combat sexual abuse and to provide sufficient protection of children, and also by way of criminalizing the new crimes with the use of new technologies. We do not want to, and we will not stay behind those international organizations. May this particular project, may this draft law be perceived as a very clear signal to the European Union citizens on how important and significant and crucial these tasks are, and they are the protection of the child. In this case, it is an even more significant signal, as it is upon us, that is on adults, lies the responsibility to protect children, because children cannot protect themselves. Once again, may I extend my words of gratitude to all those who have contributed to the work on this draft directive, and may I also say that I'm convinced that the draft directive that we have been discussing today shall not become a paper tiger and simply a replica of a law that will not be enforced, but rather a real instrument with which we will be better able to combat child abuse and provide greater protection for the child.
Grazie, Presidente.
Thank you, President. The debate has been very lengthy, but it's been a very rich debate, a very comprehensive debate, and I'm very pleased indeed. There's been a good turnout of members. People also helped me when I was preparing the text, but and people have also given me a lot of assistance in preparing this afternoon's debate. The clear goal is to be able to prosecute the offenders, to deal with these offences to be very tough and very stringent, but we've also emphasised one particular aspect. We've talked about the importance of prevention, the importance of assistance and support for victims and support for families of victims. We talked a lot about training of all of those who have a role to play in supporting and assisting victims. And I think it's important also to say to adults, to say to parents and teachers that there's a need to fill this generational technology gap, which means that adults often have no idea about how social networks function. They don't know how internet works, and so they're alienated from the world, which is very familiar to their children. And then when it comes to internet and when it comes in general to the virtual world, I'd like to make one thing clear. There should be no fear about the fact that removing child pornography material, you shouldn't see that this being the same as a restriction of freedom of expression or some sort of, you shouldn't see this as being a criminalization of internet. You shouldn't see this as being a criminalization of new forms of communication. On the contrary, internet is a great source of opportunity. It's a great it's a place where you can communicate and socialize. But our goal, and the goal in this directive, is only to hit those who are committing abuses, to hit the offenders, to deal with the exploiters. And unfortunately, internet does give these people succor. This internet is a place where they can post their images, where they can create companies. So removal just concerns the products of these very serious offences. So we're not acting as censors, we're not restricting freedom of expression. And then I'd like to say something to Mrs. Sippel, and I thank her again for all the help that she gave me. I also am perhaps a bit upset because in the text we don't have the correlation tables. We mentioned these in a recital first of all, and then we'd mentioned this in the body of the directive. But we know that there have been difficult negotiations between the institutions, and in my view, I think we have to be happy with the results that we have achieved. And I'd wind up by saying that I'm convinced of one thing that Commissioner Malmström was saying. Perhaps we could do something more when it came to sexual tourism. That's true. We could have done something more, although the directive does create the possibility for member states that want to go further. It does give them the opportunity to act. However, at the end of the day, we can say that this is a stringent text, a comprehensive text, it's a progressive text. So I'm very happy, and I think that my colleagues are happy, and I'd like to thank once again the shadow rapporteurs, all colleagues who made a contribution to this text. I thank Commissioner Malmström, and I thank the Council, the Hungarian presidency, and above all, I thank the Polish presidency. Thank you.
Thank you. The joint debate is now closed, and the vote on Mrs. Angelilli's report will take place tomorrow at 12:30. We now move to the next item on the agenda, which is the report by Mrs. Lambert on qualification and status of third country nationals or stateless persons as beneficiaries of international protection. And I give the floor first to our rapporteur, Mrs. Lambert, for 4 minutes.
Well, thank you, President. And I'd like to start by thanking all of the shadows on this report, the staff members from the 3 institutions, not least my own office, the Presidency's concerned, and the Commission for their interest, their effort and their commitment over the time that we've been negotiating the revision of this directive. And also I'd like to thank the experts who supported us as well. This year marks the 60th anniversary of the Geneva Convention on Refugees. And at the EU level, it is this directive which sets out the standards for qualification for international protection. For those classic refugees who have a well-founded fear of persecution, such as many of those who perhaps dared to oppose Colonel Gaddafi and thus qualify for refugee status, or those at risk of serious harm, perhaps a teenage girl facing the death penalty in Iran for having sexual intercourse outside marriage, and she could then qualify perhaps for subsidiary protection. As well as setting out such criteria, the directive also deals with the content of such protection, such as access to health care or education. The revision of this directive is limited, it's a recast, and the Libe Committee would like to have dealt with such issues as actors of protection, where the majority of us believe this should only be the state. That's why we've cited Article 7 as one we think should be looked at in the next review, as should the definition of family members. And I also wish to put on record my own concern at the lack of change in Article 10(1)(d), where the cumulative definition of a social group was maintained by the Commission rather than being offered as alternatives. And I trust that at least the 10 member states operating the optional perspective will continue to do so. However, some progress has been made. The definition of a social group which could suffer persecution must now include due consideration of gender-related aspects. And we've also included a reference to legal tradition and customs in Recital 30. We also include sexual orientation and, for the first time, gender identity. We shouldn't expect people to deny their identity throughout their lifetime in the hope that that will make them safe from persecution. As concerns children, the topic of the last debate, Recital 18 lays down some principles, it's not an exhaustive list, to help in determining the best interests of the child. And this principle is also linked to entitlement to benefits, and in Article 31 we've sought to improve the tracing of family for unaccompanied minors across the asylum process. With regard to the content of protection, we've tried to ensure the same treatment for all beneficiaries of international protection, and we've achieved this in many areas, notably in terms of recognition of qualifications and access to employment. People want to contribute to the country that's providing protection. But a few member states insisted on being able to maintain certain differences between the two groups, and this seems to be based on the misapprehension that those at risk of serious harm will need protection for a shorter period of time than those at risk of serious persecution. Our fight, maybe I should say our debate, over the length of residence permits yielded a small victory, but we'd invite the member states most concerned in relation to difference of treatment to reflect as to whether an annual consideration of status is a good use of public money, whether it reduces administrative burdens or provides a better context for integration than a period of at least 3 years. After all, there's a possibility of using cessation provisions if the need for protection changes. But to conclude, this revised directive takes small but important steps towards the common European asylum, but the system is only as common as the consistent high quality of its implementation across all participating member states. And we hope the movement on this directive will help provide impetus for the remaining measures and show that progress is possible. Thank you.
Köszönjük szépen, képviselőnő. Most pedig szeretettel üdvözlöm a plenáris ülés résztvevőit, és át is adom a szót.
I'd like to extend my greetings and first of all give the floor to the Minister on behalf of the Council. Minister, you have the floor.
Panie Przewodniczący.
Mr. Chairman, the MEPs, I would like to thank the Parliament for